Hi, this is Dan Maggart, Agronomic Services Manager for Prairie Land FS. As genetic potential continues to climb and overall field grain yield averages are on an upward trend, there may be nutrient deficiencies that limit yields that have not been yield limiting factors in the past. Sulfur, a secondary macronutrient, zinc and boron, both micronutrients, are both essential elements and can influence plant functions that are critical to stress mitigation and grain production in our modern genetic platforms. The following fertility best management practices will help to ensure that essential crop nutrients are positioned in adequate supply to mitigate yield limiting factors in your high production system. Well, we're certainly experiencing a much higher occurrence of sulfur deficiency here in the Midwest, and as sulfur is an essential element in the building blocks of both proteins and chlorophyll, and it's immobile in plant tissue, we often see corn exhibit that interveinal chlorosis. Sometimes we call that leaf striping in the upper crop canopy, so it's very visible to our eye. There are many dynamic factors, both environmental and cultural, that attribute to an increased occurrence in sulfur deficiency, and the most fundamental being a trend towards higher yield averages in our row crops and forage crops. And related to that higher yield is the quantity of sulfur required for grain fill. Sulfur is certainly one of those nutrients that has a high harvest index, and that is to say that as a proportion of the total sulfur taken up by the crop, a large percentage of that sulfur leaves the field with grain or when we harvest that forage crop. You can see grain demand for sulfur in this uptake and partitioning chart from the University of Illinois. So note that grain demand is represented here in the blue field in the upper right corner of the chart, but also note that only a very small percentage of that harvest index is remobilized from vegetative plant parts, and a very large quantity of needed sulfur has to come from sulfate in our soil solution or in that soil reservoir, especially for late season, while corn's in that grain fill stage R2 to R6, or the physiological maturity stage of corn. Compounding or confounding sulfur availability issues is a decrease in sulfur supply from the atmosphere, and this graphic documents a change in the available quantity of sulfate in Midwest soils over years, and that is a direct result of changes in legislation and policy brought about by the Clean Air Act. The Clean Air Act mandates industries to reduce sulfur dioxide emissions from the burning of fossil fuels, in this case in the Midwest at least from coal-fired power plants, but there are other sources as well. So this reduction in atmospheric sulfur is considered a major causal agent for the reduction of sulfates found in our soils, and it's highly correlated to sulfur deficiency in crops here in the Midwest. Subsequently, a significant portion of sulfur to meet crop demand is from soil organic matter, and that organic matter releases sulfur over time as soil microorganisms consume sulfur for food to build their bodies, and then they release that sulfur back into the soil in the form of available sulfur for the crop. That would be sulfate sulfur. And this biological process works pretty well in warm, moist soils, but tends to slow as those soils are cool or they're saturated, which slows that mineralization process down. And we typically see this situation occur in early planted crops as they display sulfur deficiencies in the early formidable growth stages. And in that early formidable stages of growth, specifically in corn, when ear development is determining kernel count, this can have a long-term impact on final grain yields. So it's very important that sulfur be in sufficient supply, especially in those stress-related environments that we find with early planting. Lastly, sulfate, a divalent anion, can be leached from the root zone and can become positionally unavailable for the crop especially when high rainfall events occur. Zinc, an essential micronutrient, can also become deficient, and we're certainly seeing more zinc deficiency showing up in row crops when crop zinc demand exceeds availability of zinc in the root zone. And somewhat like sulfur, high yields with high zinc removal quantities with grain relative to the total taken up by the plant can induce a crop deficiency, specifically and especially again when soils are cool, maybe when they're saturated, and that again has maybe to do with early planting. We have choices of several products that can be a delivery mechanism for both sulfur and zinc as essential elements, but we found excellent tools to help manage crop nutrient delivery and supply in MicroEssentials S10 and MES-Z. And both of these products have superb spreading characteristics through both spinner and airflow. They have high crushing strength, which allows for higher spinner fan speeds, and are very uniform in size, which ultimately results in a very uniform spread pattern and nutrient distribution across the soil surface. MicroEssentials MES-10 is a 1240-010 analysis, and each fertilizer granule is precision manufactured to maintain this analysis in a homogeneous product. The sulfur source in these homogeneous granules is 50% sulfate sulfur, which is immediately available for plant uptake, and 50% elemental sulfur, which requires those soil microorganisms to change it into plant available sulfur over time. So this sulfur delivery system ensures that plants have access to plant available sulfur both early season and when grain fill or grain demand is at a peak, and that's in late season as well. So MicroEssentials MES-Z has the same analysis and spread qualities as MES-10, and has an addition of 1% zinc added to each fertilizer granule. So both of these fertilizer sources are an excellent delivery tool to supply essential nutrients to meet that crop demand throughout the season in our high yield systems here in the Midwest. They provide excellent distribution of those nutrients where the plant can access them when they're most needed and during those most critical growth phases that have a high impact on final grain yields. I hope that you found this Field Insight Minute to be informative as it relates to secondary and micronutrient fertility. These nutrients aren't always required in large quantities like our primary macronutrients, but they are essential for plant growth, stress mitigation, and have a direct effect on grain yield. As always, consult with your local Prairieland FS crop specialist regarding specific fertility recommendations for your fields.